Tonight on Perspectives. Iran in the crosshairs as renewed U.S. sanctions go into effect. But do the biggest buyers of Iranian oil care? Israel retaliates against Hamas targets in Gaza as the possibility of a ceasefire draws near. Will the violence end? And California battles the worst wildfires the state has ever seen. Thanks for joining us here on Perspectives. I'm Eli Roberts in for Tracy Alexander. The day is here. A new set of American sanctions going into effect that target Iran and companies that do business with the country. And despite the financial pressure, Iranian leaders continue to vow defiance. But while Iranians navigate the new web of sanctions, the most important decision on the issue will likely be made from far, far away. Senior International Affairs correspondent Owen Alterman connecting the dots tonight.
Iranians trying to move forward, making their way through the morning rush hour, and through a new reality. At 8:31 a.m. local time Tuesday, 12:01 a.m. in the eastern U.S., the first set of new U.S. sanctions on Iran went into effect, adding potentially to the strains of an economy already in trouble.
I'm so worried about my life, future, country. And as a young girl, I'm worried about my job. There are no job opportunities, and I'm afraid of losing my job.
Iranians have felt the pressure of sanctions before. In 2012, then-President Barack Obama toughened U.S. sanctions, which he then waived or lifted after the 2015 nuclear deal. This U.S. president has taken a different tack. Donald Trump pulling out of the nuclear deal entirely on May 8th. 91 days later, many sanctions are back. To be enforced, Trump says, not only against Americans, but against non-Americans too. The president tweeting Tuesday, anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. Europe continuing to strike a defiant note.
We are encouraging small and medium enterprises in particular to increase business with and in Iran as part of something that for us is a security priority.
Looking forward, the impact of sanctions may not be decided in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, or Tehran, but in Beijing, New Delhi, Seoul, and Tokyo. Asian countries bought at least 61% of Iran's oil in 2017. If they keep buying, that will help Iran. U.S. sanctions on oil go into effect November 5th. The Trump administration is putting pressure on Asian countries to cut back on those oil imports. So far, India and South Korea have shown signs of heeding the call. Not so in China, and Japan is wavering. Foreign capitals deciding Iran's fate, leaving Iranians contemplating their future. Owen Alterman, I-24 News.
And joining us from Washington, Sina Azodi, who is an expert on Iran. And of course, here in studio with me, I-24 News Senior International Affairs correspondent Owen Alterman. Owen, I want to start with you because these renewed sanctions that the U.S. is putting in place are having an effect on European oil buys from Iran, also possibly India and South Korea. But the elephant in the room is what about China, one, and two, who are the countries that actually buy oil from Iran?
Well, Eli, we'll start with that second part. We talked about it a little bit in the report and that huge percentage of Asian countries that buy Iranian oil. Let's take a look at what the numbers actually are. These come from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, which itself took it from another source. And as you can see, those four countries, China, India, South Korea, and Japan, buy 61% of Iranian oil. We should say bought 61%. These are numbers for 2017. And then the rest you can see in gray. So these four countries have a huge impact. And you're right. Three of the four, India, South Korea, and Japan, part of the U.S. alliance system, gives the U.S. particular political and security leverage over those countries. And at least India and South Korea have come into line, and Japan still trying to negotiate with the U.S. government. As you said, Eli, that leaves China. The Chinese have said they're not going to have any part in this, and they're going to continue to buy oil from the United States. Some of their companies and certainly some of their banks protected from U.S. sanctions. Why? They don't do business in the United States. So the usual club that the U.S. government can hold over companies and banks isn't really held over those. How could it then be used? Well, one way is that sanctions enforcers could try to go against ships, against insurers, against other targets connected to these companies. And second, it could become part of the bilateral relationship between the United States and China. Eli, I don't have to remind you, that's already a complicated relationship. These two countries either on the verge of or in a trade war. The United States also wanting China's cooperation on North Korea. There's tension in the South China Sea. This could become part of that complicated mix of issues. Again, but if the Trump administration really truly wants to prioritize this, they could take it to the finish line.
Sina, I want to bring you into the conversation right now because these renewed sanctions put in place by the Trump administration are already having an effect on the Iranian economy, and things aren't good as it is already. My question for you is, are Iran's leaders sweating this?
Absolutely, but we have to keep in mind that, the sanctions that are going to affect today, or went into effect today, were pretty marginal compared to the sanctions that are supposed to come into effect on November 7th. And the other issue is that after President Trump announced that he's going to withdraw the U.S. from the deal, companies already, at the time already started pulling out of Iran. So Iranians have already seen the effects of the deal, of Trump's withdrawal from the deal. But as I said, the important part of President Trump's decision will be November 7th, when Iran is supposed to not be able to sell its oil.
All right, so the sanctions that we are hearing about today, Sina, what kind of a real effect might they have? And making that question slightly more specific, what about the people in Iran? Because like you said, they are seeing the effects of this right now. Could it possibly challenge the regime if people are opposed to these sanctions and the effect that it's actually having on their lives?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the sanctions will affect Iranian lives. In 2011, when the sanctions went into effect initially, thousands of Iranians were laid off from the Iran's auto industry. And as the sanctions are coming back again on Iran's auto industry, we should expect that, more people will be laid off, and the prices will go up. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the problem with authoritarian states is when you have a state with more resources and the people can barely afford their livings, the state will have more power vis-a-vis its people. So you're strengthening the state. You're undermining the status of people who are actually in need of food and other essentials.
Okay, Sina, thank you for that. And I want to turn the conversation back to you, Oren, here in studio, because these sanctions are going into place today. As Sina just told us, there's another round set to go in place on November 7th. Is there anything that Iran could do, theoretically, to keep the sanctions from actually going into effect?
Well, here there is a place for Washington to play a part in decision-making. Eli, President Trump has said he's willing to meet with Hassan Rouhani, reportedly has asked for meetings in the past. The two will be together, at least in the same city. For the opening of the UN General Assembly in New York in September, there could be talks, and those talks could persuade the United States to hold off on imposing new sanctions. But again, I remind you, even in the North Korea case, when Donald Trump went to Singapore to meet with Kim Jong-un, the U.S. kept and has still kept those sanctions in place to continue the pressure on North Korea, what the president had called maximum pressure. Again, the same could be in store for Iran unless there really is a sense that the sanctions should be at least held off on after that November 5th deadline. But I think that that's a long shot, even if the two go on ahead into the meeting.
Sina, I have one more question for you while we have you. What about the Strait of Hormuz? Because that is an issue that is blowing up right now. Will Iran block it? Will they not block it? What do you know? You've got 30 seconds.
Well, on the Strait of Hormuz, at this point, I see it very unlikely that Iranians will decide to even try to close the Strait of Hormuz. But we have seen repeatedly, and thanks to documents that are out, we know that when Iranians are pressured or they feel that they're cornered, they may take actions that are more aggressive. And if Iran decides, for whatever reason, to close the Strait of Hormuz, it has to take into consideration that the U.S. will act to open the Strait of Hormuz. And in fact, And in fact, the former commander of IRGC
Sina, I gotta leave it there. The clock is ticking. Sina, thank you for that perspective. Stay tuned. We'll be back in a moment.
Americans have simply lost trust in news media.
What happened to the news? All I get is a daily serving of lies.
Do your job and just tell me the news.
I am overloaded with news that is useless.
Give me the facts. Let me sort it. Where's the integrity?
Why is the news so biased? I will never trust the media.
I'm Emily Francis on I-24 News. Join us on Trending right here on the show that shines the light on the many amazing people doing positive work to inspire. This is the show about building bridges.
Welcome back. You're watching Perspectives on I-24 News. The Israeli military striking a Hamas post in the Gaza Strip after two soldiers came under fire on the Israeli side of the border. Two Hamas militants were killed in the strike. The Israeli military attacked the same Hamas position from where the soldiers were fired on. All of this comes as back-channel negotiations are underway between Israel and Hamas in an effort to avert a full-scale war. A possible ceasefire deal negotiated with the help of Egypt and the United Nations could see Hamas end the fire balloon attacks on Israeli territory in exchange for fully opening the Kerem Shalom border crossing to commercial goods. It could also see Israel provide more electricity to Gaza, with Egypt possibly making way for a seaport and airport for Gaza, which would be set to be built in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. But today, Hamas responding to the Israeli retaliation on its post.
The resistance cannot be handed over to the occupation by imposing a policy of bombing sites and targeting the resistance without paying the price. We consider it extremely dangerous that Israel intentionally targets a site of the Al-Qassam brigades.
And I-24 senior defense correspondent Shai Ben-Ari at the border between Israel and Gaza just a few moments ago. He has this report.
It's a pretty serious incident today with Hamas gunmen opening fire from within a Hamas outpost near the Israel-Gaza border. Within seconds, the Israeli army responding with tank fire against the source of that gunfire, indeed leading to the death of two Hamas military wing members. Hamas issuing a statement within a few hours that this gunfire was actually part of a training exercise being held within the Gaza Strip. And in the past hour or so, we have seen indications that the Israeli army now understands that that was indeed the situation. Earlier, it had stated that the gunfire actually targeted its troops, though no one was, of course, injured as a result of that. But now it seems that the Israeli army has changed its position on those events. All this happening as there is more and more talk of perhaps some sort of arrangement to find some sort of solution for the ongoing crisis between Israel and Hamas. Right now, there isn't perhaps a lot of optimism, I would say, on either side of hopes for an overall cessation of hostilities, let's call it, but perhaps a smaller scale sort of arrangement which could see cessation of these launchings of kites and balloons that we've seen burn thousands of acres of agricultural fields here on the Israeli side, as well as perhaps the opening of the Kerem Shalom border crossing, which could ease the humanitarian situation inside the Strip. In terms of a broader arrangement which could see the release of Israeli hostages from within Gaza and the removal of the blockade on the Gaza Strip, right now, chances aren't looking too good for that, but perhaps efforts continue on that front as well. We'll keep you updated on all of this, of course. That's all for now from the Israel-Gaza border. Shai Ben-Ari, I-24 News.
All right, and that was I-24 Shai Ben-Ari for us at the border between Israel and Gaza. But with me here in studio, I-24's Middle East correspondent, Emily Rose. And Emily, I want to turn back to what we heard from that Hamas spokesman just before we heard from Shai, because he said that he's pushing back on the Israeli strike on that Hamas post. Now, the two soldiers were fired on by Hamas militants, right? And Israel responded to the same post where that fire came from. Hamas has this new strategy. It's called an eye for an eye. So you take one of ours, we take one of yours. Does this fit into Hamas's overall strategy that we're seeing today?
Well, of course, according to Hamas in the statement that they released, this was a target, a practice exercise. That's what they claim. And I think what we could see now is, as you mentioned, that eye for an eye strategy escalate even further, and we could see a further escalation even into the night. This is, as we saw it from that report, one of the more serious incidents that we've seen along this border. But through the backdrop of it all are diplomatic processes that are happening to obtain some kind of a ceasefire and some kind of a truce between these two feuding bodies.
All right, now, Israel does hold Hamas responsible for everything that goes on in the Gaza Strip. And today, just as proof of that, we did get a tweet from the IDF, from the Israeli military, that says, let's pull it up there, the Israeli military tweeting today that the IDF is prepared to target any aggression against Israel and holds Hamas responsible for everything happening in and emanating from the Gaza Strip. But you also have groups like Islamic Jihad. You even have pockets of ISIS that are existing within the Gaza Strip at this point. Can Hamas really stop those other groups, Emily, if you have these groups who are attacking Israel, but Hamas is trying to negotiate with Israel? Are they really under Hamas's control?
Well, that's the main question here. And Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are constantly feuding. Their main point of contention between any reconciliation talks are they're both vying for security control over the Gaza Strip. And Hamas has to prove that it can actually keep a lock on those Islamist militant groups that you spoke of, and that it can prevent them from going rogue and committing violent acts against Israel, and keep that border quiet, and that any truce deal that it signs would be worth the paper, more than the paper that it is in fact written on. That's what we know is according to Hamas. But there have been some Gazan residents who don't exactly align with that line of thinking that comes from the policy level of Hamas. Let's hear what one of them had to say.
This is not a truce. This is deception from the enemy. If the enemy wants a truce, he wouldn't do what he did today. The enemy is crafty and he can't be trusted. My message to the Palestinian people is to fight for God and to get back the rights of what was stolen.
So you can see Hamas is facing that challenge. Can they cap down and lock down on those very extremist undercurrents who seek to perpetrate these attacks consistently on that border? Has the fire gone beyond all control? Or can they prove that they actually can keep security, and that they can have the keys to that proverbial car and keep it safe and have security control in the Strip without having to rely on the Palestinian Authority to keep that security?
All right, let's shift gears, because Israel did leave Gaza in 2005. It evacuated all of its settlements there, left the territory completely in Palestinian hands, but then Hamas won the election in 2006 and started firing rockets into Israel. And that's when Israel and Egypt, important to remember, Egypt is a part of this, put the blockade in place on Gaza. Today, Israeli Minister of Immigration and Absorption, Ziv Elkin, saying that Israel left Gaza in 2005 and that humanitarian issues are something for the Arab world to sort out, not Israel. Let's take a listen to what he said.
We left Gaza. If someone strikes us from Gaza, they will get hit back. Let the Arab world resolve the internal humanitarian problem of the Gaza Strip. Why should we bear responsibility for this?
Okay, so why should we bear responsibility for this, Emily? Because if there is a ceasefire agreement, what would that mean for the humanitarian situation?
Well, see, putting any ceasefire agreement into place, as the Hamas claims on the Gazan side, really does delay dealing with that humanitarian crisis. And that looming humanitarian crisis becomes a security threat on Israel's borders. They're very much intertwined. Now, you mentioned Egypt's heavy hand here and the fact that Egypt has a part in that blockade. Well, Ismail Haniyeh, who is the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, maintains very close ties with Egypt. And Egypt calls a lot of the shots in the Gaza Strip. So it is fair in some sense to place at least some of the responsibility upon Egypt to rehabilitate the Gaza Strip.
Emily, I want to ask you one question about Egypt very quickly, and that is, if there is a ceasefire agreement, Hamas is aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is banned. So what would it take for Egypt to actually lift the blockade from its perspective when Hamas, its enemy, is in charge of the Gaza Strip?
Well, just as always in the Middle East, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There are Islamic undercurrents. You mentioned the Islamic State. They're fighting in the Sinai, and both Egypt and Hamas are fighting against them. So it could be that that's where the two meet.
All right. Emily Rose, thank you for that. And next on Perspectives, ISIS defeated, but the thorny problem of what to do with all the foreign wives and children who are in Syria now, married to former ISIS fighters. It's not easy, and it's a mess. We're going to talk about it next. Stay tuned.
You want my coffee, honey?
Roku Express. Now 500,000 movies and TV episodes? This is the ultimate streaming adventure.
Jack. Oh, great choice. Hey, where's my coffee?
Our world is becoming increasingly connected. 6.5 million Wi-Fi-enabled devices are now shipping every day, and global consumer internet traffic is growing exponentially. We are creating breakthrough technologies that connect millions of people and billions of devices. We're delivering robust, reliable Wi-Fi solutions that stream ultra-high-definition video flawlessly, and writing television's next chapter with solutions that make entertainment connected, immersive, and mobile. We are Eris, and we're powering your digital world.
The trends, the fads, the breakthroughs. Get it all on Trending. From food, music, and art to advances in modern medicine. Meet the trendsetters and the tech giants who make it all happen on Trending with Emily Francis.
Politics, economics, business, and technology. Get the real news and the real insight about what's happening around the world. Michelle McCory breaks down the top stories of the day from the Middle East to the U.S. Weeknights beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern.
Welcome back. You're watching Perspectives on I-24 News. The wife of a Japanese journalist captured and held by an al-Qaeda affiliate since 2015 is pleading for the life of her husband, Junpei Yasuda, saying that she now feels this is a moment of urgency. Videos released throughout his capture show him in a state of gradual decline. But the most recent shows him kneeling in front of two hooded gunmen, pleading for his life right there.
I want my husband to step onto the land of his mother country, Japan, so I beg them to return him as soon as possible. When I saw the latest video of him, I realized I couldn't be optimistic anymore, and that the situation now has a sense of urgency. I have kept silent and done nothing for the last 3 years. I regret the time that has passed by only waiting.
Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga says the government is doing everything in its power to get Junpei back, but the reality is grim. Two Japanese journalists captured by the Islamic State in 2014 were beheaded just a few months after being taken. And here's another one for you. The foreign wives and foreign children of Islamic State fighters now living in a rebel-controlled camp in northeast Syria. It's because the Islamic State has largely been defeated, with the capital, Raqqa, now in Syrian government hands. But where to go? That is the question many of these foreigners who join the Islamic State have to ask. And the answer isn't easy. No one wants them. And wherever they return, they'll likely face prosecution for their allegiance to the Islamic State. Some say they'd rather stay in the camp than return to their home countries.
As I was very afraid of ISIS, and because I tried to escape ISIS where I could be executed, I was compelled to stay. My husband frequently threatened me that if I returned to my home country, he would have appealed to the Muslim police. Because of my fear, I stayed in Raqqa, and I have nothing to do but wait for the Kurds.
We moved from Egypt to Raqqa in 2014 via Turkey. I did not work anywhere, and my husband worked in the ISIS administration. In 2017, we found ourselves surrounded by the Syrian Democratic Forces. If I face the court, I am innocent. I did nothing wrong. I want to face trial in this country, not in Egypt. I do not want to go back to Egypt, and I do not want to face trial in Egypt. Let another country's court judge me. Let another country's court rule the verdict, which they consider just, but I do not want to return to Egypt.
There are about 2,000 people living in the camp. They have to stay there until Kurdish authorities who are in charge of the camp decide what to do with these people. And I-24's Emily Rose is following their story. And Emily, what do you do with them?
Well, I just have to add another element to that story, is that a lot of these women, because they were taken against their will, often to return to their cities of origin, they feel, even if they're going to return to the cities from whence they came, they feel like their neighbors, people around them actually turn them in. So even returning to their own cities, if they could, if that were possible, sometimes seems to them very, very scary. And then if we're discussing the question of retribution and having international tribunals for these, some of these, this could be, particularly when we're talking about Yazidis, this could be one of the most largely documented genocides potentially in the history of humanity. These women, as soon as they're rescued, as soon as they are freed by Kurdish authorities, are forced to give testimony right away, even before they're ready to talk about the atrocities that happened to them. So when we're looking at it on a local level, if you, in terms of the document and what you have to try them, you have the documented facts. The question is, would there be an international tribunal that is in fact strong enough or has the will enough to do anything about it?
Or would they be sent back to their home countries? Or would they stay in Syria and face charges there? Because prosecution is very much at the forefront of what comes next for these people. What would be likely? Would it be an international tribunal, as you said? Would they go back to their home countries, or would they stay in Syria?
Well, as it's been explained to me, because if you have each state or each country has its own procedure for dealing with foreign militants, so it would have to be by country basis. For instance, if you had militants who came from certain countries in Iraq, they would each face their protocol, their particular protocol back home. Facing them in Syria is a little bit more convoluted because we're talking about the after effects and aftermath of the Syrian civil war. So within that, would there be a place for trying those militants? Maybe not in the foreseeable future, in the sense that there are still many pieces of the Syrian civil war that are left unanswered.
Doing what these people did, which is to join ISIS, to leave their home country, it's not a normal thing to do. Can they be trusted if they were to go back to their home countries? Can they be rehabilitated? Can they ultimately lead a normal life after doing what they did, after going what they've been through?
Even more so, Eli, we know that a tactic of the Islamic State is to inspire violence online, use social media and propaganda. We've seen that over the course of the past, just even several years, ISIS has lost 98% of the territory that it conquered earlier in Iraq and Syria. And in light of that, it's turning back to those familiar tactics that you mentioned in the beginning of the segment, stark images, very scary videos, very terrorizing videos that are circulating on social media. And even scarier is that it could inspire those kind of attacks back in the Western countries from which those militants came. As it feels backed into a corner of losing territory, it could go back to those tactics of inspiring that violence. So the West doesn't want these people? The West doesn't necessarily want those people, but often, very often, they end up returning anyways because they're expatriates and they go back.
What about the kids? If they go back to their home countries, will they be separated from their parents?
Well, that's another story. When you look, if you're talking about particularly Yazidis, for instance, who have been kidnapped by ISIS, they're what was deemed ISIS brides. A lot of those children are the product of forced rape, and a lot of the children also were sold as ISIS prizes or made to be child soldiers. So even if they can be rehabilitated, it's a long haul to rehabilitation, and very often the mothers have a very difficult relationship even with those children themselves. So a lot of that is humanitarian work that is now being done on the ground, but there are certainly a lot of gaps in the planning for how that can be used going forward.
Wow. What a mess to sort out. I-24's Emily Rose, thank you for that. And next on Perspectives, former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort continues to make his case, but it's not looking good. The Star Witness, next.
Unflinching, opinionated. Weeknights, David Schuster and Shayna Estulin bring you analysis, interviews, and opinions that connect us to the Middle East and the world. Watch Crossroads weeknight starting at 6 p.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
I'm Lauren Izzo on I-24 News. Join me on High Definition right here for an in-depth understanding of Israel's diverse society in groundbreaking documentaries.
I-24 News.
We turn now to the United States, where the trial continues in the case against former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. Manafort's one-time business partner, Rick Gates, is on the stand for a second day after testifying that the two committed crimes together. Janai Norman has the latest.
The one-time Trump campaign aide turned special counsel star witness. Rick Gates took center stage in Robert Mueller's case against Paul Manafort, cutting a deal with prosecutors and testifying against his old boss. Today, the defense is expected to challenge Gates' credibility after he admitted in court that he spent years committing crimes with Manafort, including not reporting more than a dozen offshore accounts. The prosecutors asking, did you commit any crimes with Mr. Manafort? Yes, Gates answered. Question, how much did you fail to report? Over the years, several $1 million. Prosecutors allege Manafort falsified tax returns and failed to report tens of millions of dollars he earned while working for a Ukrainian political party with deep ties to Russia. Gates also admitting to embezzling several $100,000 from Manafort. In February, Gates pled guilty to conspiracy and lying to federal authorities. He hasn't been sentenced yet, but flipped, turning on his former business partner who's pled not guilty. One of Manafort's lawyers telling the court last week that Gates is, quote, willing to say anything to save himself.
And that was Janai Norman reporting for us. Let's go live to where all of this is happening, which is Washington, D.C. And that's where we find I-24 senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv. And Dan, the star witness Rick Gates saying today on the stand that he and former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort committed crimes together. Just how big is that admission?
Well, there have been other witnesses against Manafort, and it's really the documents that are damning about what Paul Manafort did as an international political advisor. A lot of work for pro-Russian Ukrainians in Ukraine. That work stopped, apparently, in 2014, at least when President Yanukovych was overthrown in Ukraine. And Rick Gates was working with him the whole time. And now Gates has turned into a prosecution witness. He doesn't have immunity, but he's working out a deal with the prosecution in that if he testifies against Manafort, well, then the punishment against Gates would go easier. Okay, so Manafort's in deep trouble. The evidence seems to be damning of bank fraud, improperly applying for loans, also hiding $60 million of income and having unreported bank accounts. Gates, in fact, testified 15 overseas bank accounts that together they ran without telling the U.S. government. That's illegal. The question is, will Manafort in any way turn against Donald Trump? Because Manafort, for 3 months in 2016, was chairman of the Trump for President campaign. Rick Gates also worked in that campaign. Does this touch upon Trump at all? All we have so far in today's testimony, a little note that the jury was shown that Manafort and Gates were giving Yankee tickets, that's right, baseball tickets in New York, to Trump, probably Donald Trump, 5 years ago when he was just a businessman in New York. Of course, we all know that later all of this became politically important. We don't yet know the possible connections to Trump. The trial seems to be a separate thing about Manafort and Gates' crimes that they did outside of their work for the Trump campaign. Eli.
Dan, let's talk about Paul Manafort's position when he did accept that role as the chairman of Trump's campaign. Because despite making all that money in Ukraine with the pro-Russian party that you just spoke about, he was hard up for cash. He was almost out of money. And yet he took that job at no charge.
Isn't that something? Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, he spent lots of money by buying 7 properties and fancy clothing. There's been a lot of publicity about that from the opening statement by prosecutors last week. So he was running out of money, yet he offered to work for the Trump campaign for free, unpaid, to be the chairman of the campaign and bring his expertise from previous campaigns in the United States. Why would he do it for free, right? One theory that a lot of Trump critics say is that Manafort might have been an agent for the Russians. The Russians wanted their guy Manafort to be close to the candidate for president. Others say that Manafort himself wanted the connection, which later he could cash in on. By the way, Gates testifying against Manafort was asked by a prosecutor, so what was Manafort's goal? What was his motivation? And Gates said, greed. Well, That's a human quality, I suppose. Eli?
This story just never ends. Dan Raviv reporting live for us from Washington. Thank you for that. And it's a story you might not hear anywhere else. A young, outspoken woman rising in the Democratic Party, aiming for Congress. But Rashida Tlaib is a Palestinian-American who is part of the so-called blue wave that set the tone for this year's primaries. I-24's Bianca Zanini with this.
Hey everyone, it's me. Another young, outspoken woman rising in the Democratic Party and aiming for Congress. Rashida Tlaib, a Palestinian American, is part of the so-called blue wave that set the tone for this year's primaries. In it, young progressive candidates from minority communities challenging the Democratic establishment.
I always tell people, in some ways, Trump being elected president of the United States was kind of like the bat signal.
Since Donald Trump took office in 2016, headlines have described a divided country and a weakened Democratic Party in a state of shock. Now, candidates are attempting to mobilize the left-wing base of America, essentially running campaigns on their opposition to Trump. In Tlaib's Michigan, 13 Muslim candidates are running for office. There are more than 3.3 million Muslims living in the U.S., and yet Muslim Americans hold just 2 of the 535 seats in Congress. This year, that could change.
Michigan.
Running for governor of Michigan, Abdul El-Sayed.
I'm a doctor. I had the privilege of rebuilding Detroit's health department after it had been shut down in a city with a higher infant mortality rate than my father's native Egypt.
A progressive outsider with the support of Bernie Sanders, going for the title of the first Muslim American governor in the nation. Meanwhile, Michigan's heavily Democratic Jewish community is figuring out how to react to this wave of Muslim American progressives, who mostly share the same views on domestic policies, but who could substantially differ on one particular issue: Israel. Let's get this done. Candidates like El-Sayed and Tlaib are part of a movement. Some analysts saying they are setting the tone for the future of the Democratic Party and potentially shaking the ground enough to make it to Congress. Bianca Zanini, I-24 News.
And things even getting political out on the West Coast. The city of West Hollywood making a symbolic move, voting in favor of getting rid of President Donald Trump's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Now, it's important to remember that the West Hollywood City Council has no jurisdiction over Walk of Fame stars. It's not even in WeHo. It's in Hollywood. That's a part of Los Angeles. But West Hollywood City Council members wanted to make the point that they think the star should be removed. The council says Trump's treatment of women and the ongoing allegations of collusion with Russia are enough of a reason to get that star off the walk. Trump got the star back in 2007 for his involvement in the Miss Universe pageant. And staying in California, it is exactly what emergency officials in that state have been fearing. 2 massive wildfires in the northern part of the state have now combined, forming the largest fire in the state's history. Check out that video. More than 14,000 firefighters are now on the front lines statewide. Maggie Rulli reports on 18 major fires burning, including a new blaze in Orange County that's exploding in size, trapping hikers on a mountain.
This morning, the California wildfire disaster is growing more desperate and historic. The fires, known as the Mendocino Complex northwest of Sacramento, are now joining together, fueled by dry vegetation and hot, windy weather, to become the largest fire California has ever seen, burning an area the size of Los Angeles. At least 75 homes destroyed, more than 9,000 buildings threatened, and the fire only 30% contained. The haze of smoke is so bad, health officials are urging people to avoid outdoor activities for the rest of the week. And this morning, dramatic new images from the southern part of the state. In the Cleveland National Forest, the blaze, dubbed the Holy Fire, has more than quadrupled in size in just hours, forcing evacuations.
The flames are across the road we couldn't cross. And I was like, whoa. So I turn around, we hurry home, we grab a few things. We're in the cabin only 5 minutes. But that 5 minutes, the flames had already come up over the hill. So those cabins are gone for sure.
The massive cloud of smoke seen in these newly released pictures. Down below, an elderly couple out for a hike became stranded on this mountain, trapped by the fire. They were forced to retreat into the canyon without cell reception. They were later spotted by rescue teams and finally hoisted to safety into this chopper. Officials say climate change has made the fire season longer with more intense fires, and they deny President Trump's recent claim that the state's water policy is hurting firefighting efforts.
What a nightmare. Maggie Rulli reporting for us from California. Next on Perspectives, you heard about the Russian effort to put fake news on social media, but now we're learning the scope of that operation was much bigger than we thought. Stay tuned. That conversation next.
I'm Jordana Miller at I-24 News. Join me for the Holy Land Uncovered, a look at this remarkable land filled with so much faith and history and archaeology.
Fearless, timely, and always engaging. Every night, David Schuster brings the news from around the world to your front door. Watch Stateside, weeknights at 9 p.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
Esta semana en News 24, USAID, la Agencia para el Desarrollo Internacional, financió durante la administración Obama a ISRA, una organización terrorista en Sudán. Benjamín Netanyahu, relator de ficciones, nos cuenta la historia de Fatame, una joven iraní de 15 años. Bajo el lema "En tiempos de impunidad, hacer memoria es exigir justicia", se realizó en Buenos Aires el acto por el 24 aniversario del ataque terrorista a la AMIA. News 24, el magazine semanal en español de I-24 News.
I-24 News.
Welcome back. You're watching Perspectives on I-24 News. We have all heard about the Russian attempts on social media to put out fake news during the 2016 U.S. presidential election. But it doesn't end there. It turns out Russian social media accounts behind some of the fake news also tried to influence relations between the U.S. and Israel. That allegation coming out today as researchers in the U.S. found nearly 3 million posts linked to what are called Russian troll farms. At least 60% of those posts dealt with Israel, and they tried to build up the relationship between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump. The posts were not geared toward the Israeli audience, though. That's important to remember. Instead, they were working to influence Americans, where the Jewish state has become a more polarizing issue. And here with me now in studio is cybersecurity expert Oren Elimelech. And Oren, my first question for you is why? Why target this relationship between the United States and Israel?
Thank you very much, Eli. The target is they want to influence the American, as you just mentioned, the American opinion. They're trying to create a conflict, all right? They influence both the far right and the right, and also the left. They try to influence everybody to create a contradiction, to create a conflict, and that is geared toward the U.S. audience.
Now, some of these posts were geared toward a different audience, with the post calling Israel an apartheid state, which is definitely not pro-Israel, because originally we saw posts that were trying to link Netanyahu and Trump to have a positive relationship, but we also saw some negative posts as well. What would be the reason for doing that from a Russian perspective?
The Russian perspective is to create a conflict, to create a contradiction, as we both mentioned. And we can look back and what happened also in Europe with Le Pen. They tried to influence in France. They tried to influence also in Spain, in other areas. And if we look back, actually, those Russians account are part of, you mentioned the election, the 2016 election, where they influenced. Actually, prior to that, they tried to influence another 21 states before that. And this is an ongoing. They're trying to influence, if you look back, it happened also with the U.S. going back to South Africa, where the Americans tried to do the same, to create a contradiction, to create a conflict, a rise, contradiction. And that actually helped them in the 2016 election with Trump. People don't know what to do, and people are distressed throughout, and the opinion is not clear. And I don't want to be blunt, but, you know, people sometimes are very easy to affect, to project the message, and this is what they're building on.
Okay, well, that segues perfectly to my next question for you. You are a cybersecurity expert, so you know all about how to stop this. My question is there a way to stop it? What would be the tactics or the techniques that a government like the U.S. or like Israel could take to possibly block this kind of fake news?
It's a very good question, thank you. And it's not only looking at the technology part, not only looking at the government side, it's part of a whole perspective. As we talked earlier, people need to be more vigilant. They need to be more aware of what they're reading and not believe anything that they're reading. And companies like, for example, Facebook is going through a change. We mentioned this earlier, a few months ago, that Facebook needs to be more aware. And they just recently released a cast that they're saying that they're going to be more active regarding censorship. And today,
but that's a private company. What about
yes,
the government?
The government should be also actively encouraging to, for example, in Israel, there's the National CERT, trying to find more ways to influence these accounts, these actions. And it's not only Israel, U.S., everybody throughout the world. And this should be an all-around solution, looking both at government, private companies, and also as the citizens.
Okay, we've got 30 seconds. We heard about the fake news. Is there anything else that's at risk from a cybersecurity perspective in this conversation today?
Yes, our privacy. Okay, we should be more about our privacy, what we're sharing, because they're able to take this and use it against us to influence us.
All right, Oren Elimelech, thank you for that. And here in Israel, controversy continues to simmer over the newly passed nation-state law. The Netanyahu government says it needs to strengthen in law the Jewish character of the Jewish state, but critics say it discriminates against the country's non-Jewish minorities. A petition to the High Court of Justice asking for the law to be voided was filed by a group of Israeli Arab leaders and rights groups, and they got a hearing today. Our diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim was at court.
Today makes number 4, the 4th petition filed against the controversial Jewish nation-state law. Today, the Adalah Arab Civil Rights Organization, together with the Association of Civil Rights in Israel, filed a petition here at the Supreme Court in Jerusalem to try to have that law struck down. The Jewish nation-state law was passed last month by a slim margin in the Israeli parliament. It's part of the basic laws, the de facto constitution of the state of Israel, and it defines the Jewish nation-state and some of its foundations. But critics say it takes away from minority rights here in the country. Already, petitions have been filed by the Bedouin communities, along with the left-wing Meretz Party and members of the Druze community in the Israeli parliament. Today's petition will not be heard for quite some time. Meanwhile, Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, a prominent member of the government, has said if the High Court dares to touch the Jewish nation-state law, it will cause an earthquake. The Supreme Court has been reluctant to strike down any basic laws for fear of infringing on the parliament's rights, but they say if the parliament goes too far, they'll have to do so. And in fact, the deputy president of the High Court said last month in a separate ruling that one of the reasons to possibly strike down a basic law would be if it infringes upon Jewish values as both a Jewish and democratic state. Reporting from the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, Mike Wagenheim for I-24 News.
All right, Mike, thank you. And a press conference of the Arab leaders and activists who filed the suit was disrupted by a man who demanded that they take tougher actions against the law. He interrupted comments by lawmaker Jamal Zahalka, who was a part of the United Arab List.
The Arab public is changing direction today. We are turning to the world and saying that we are a minority at risk, a minority in danger. We are demanding protection for our rights from the world, and we have a tangible document before us showing this is apartheid and racism.
So it's an open question, what will happen next? But next on Perspectives, we're going to talk about using technology to remember history. Virtual reality making it possible to see the Warsaw uprisings and what they were really like in person. Erica Jackson is with us after the break. Stay tuned.
simply security. Your weekly look into security, intelligence, and strategic affairs. Our team brings the latest on the major international conflicts. Analysis of the major security issues right here in the Middle East and around the globe. Join us for a close look at innovative military technology and get up to speed with what's happening in cyberspace. Saturdays only on I-24 News.
I'm Michelle McCrory on I-24 News. Join me on Clear Cut, where we cut to the chase with a straightforward yet insightful breakdown of the world's top political and economic stories.
Weeknights beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
Okay, so here's a question for you. If you were transported to one of the biggest battles during World War II, what kind of choices would you make? It's not a hypothetical question, because a new virtual reality exhibit in Poland takes a look at one of the war's most historic events. It's the Warsaw Uprising. Here's more from Erica Jackson.
It's a virtual reality experience bringing one of World War II's most tragic battles back to life. At a new virtual reality exhibit funded by the National Center of Culture at the Kortegarda Gallery, visitors can put on an Oculus Go headset, transporting them to one of the most famous battles of World War II, the Warsaw Uprising. It was a violent battle which started on August 1st, 1944. When 50,000 young men and women rose up against Nazis occupying the capital. The bloody 2 months of fighting took a massive toll, with the Nazis killing 200,000 insurgents and civilians. And now, 74 years later, the experience is allowing visitors to answer the question, what would you do?
When we think about World War II, and we watch war movies, for example, and many times we ask ourselves, what would I do in this kind of situation? Does my choices would be the same as my grandfather's?
While the film includes fictional scenes, it follows the real-life storyline surrounding an insurgent named Władysław Sieroszewski, who was shot in the heart by Germans but survived, thanks to a wallet in his pocket holding a letter from his daughter, which blocked the bullet. Visitors say it's the realistic scenes which make the exhibit a moving experience.
I found that the film itself gave me a real personal experience, very personal experience of what it was like, even in a very small way, to be there.
With few who lived through the uprising remaining alive, the experience keeps this page in history from being forgotten.
This exhibit is very important because of the topic of the Warsaw Uprising. Today, not many people still remember those days, but we can find people who lived in those times on the streets of Warsaw.
The virtual reality exhibit comes to an end on September 16th. But for people who can't make it to Warsaw for the VR experience, the director aims to bring the project to other international museums and film festivals. Erica Jackson, I-24 News.
And we move a few spaces to the east, from Poland to Russia, where the International Army Games are happening right now. And it is really a sight to see. Teams putting tanks into action. China won the first day, but teams from Russia, Mongolia, Armenia, even Venezuela are set to compete in the final. Here's a look at the action. And that looks like a scene from a Hollywood set, but now we're going to turn to the real Hollywood, where Jason Nathanson has the latest, plus new details on a major health scare for Beyonce.
Beyoncé's health and the health of her twin babies was in danger, the superstar singer says in the new issue of Vogue. She says at the end of her pregnancy, she was swollen from toxemia on bed rest for a month and weighed 218 pounds. And she had to have an emergency C-section. After Rumi and Sir were born, Beyoncé says they spent weeks in the NICU, and it took her quite a while to bounce back from the major surgery. Her twins celebrated their first birthday in June. Tough times for Pink. She had to miss a couple of shows in Sydney and checked into the hospital with a virus. She missed Friday's show, powered through Saturdays, but was diagnosed with a gastric virus and had to miss Monday's show. Robert Redford sticking by his 2016 statement that he's retiring from acting, telling Entertainment Weekly that his upcoming movie, The Old Man and the Gun, is his last. That'll give the 81-year-old 60 years in front of the camera. But it's all right. Drake's reign as king of the Billboard charts continues. Scorpion remains at the top of the Billboard 200 album chart for a 5th straight week. Kiki, do you love me?
And that wraps it up for today's edition of Perspectives. We're going to leave you with some images coming to us from northern Greece. They're of seahorses. And if you're like me, you probably didn't realize that they are such a rare sight. But they are, especially in this part of Greece, where divers say the ocean floor is barren. It makes it hard for them to hide from predators, and it also makes it all the more remarkable what diver Vasilis Mintogiannis saw. Not just one, but two, and then a group of seahorses passing by. Check it out. You can see it for yourself. What a great way to end the night or morning wherever you are. I'm Eli Roberts in for Tracy Alexander. Thanks for joining us.